Welcome to our deep dive on compassion. Looks like you've been exploring James Kirby's Choose Compassion. Really cool choice. It digs into what motivates us to help other people and when we might hesitate.
It's really fascinating. Kirby digs into the complexities of compassion. He shows us that it's not just about feeling empathy or just being kind, there's science. And even evolution is involved.
Yeah.
hmm
And he even says that true compassion takes courage and wisdom, not just warm feelings.
Yeah. That's a really important point. Think about those healthcare workers when the pandemic started. They faced incredible risks to alleviate the suffering of their patients. That's courage in action.
Absolutely.
Would you say?
Totally. And they didn't just rush in blindly either. They used all the PPE,
hmm
even though it was uncomfortable, to protect themselves while helping others. Kirby actually talks about his brother, a respiratory therapist who's right there in the thick of it. That's where the wisdom comes in.
Exactly. Knowing how to help effectively and safely at the same time. Good intentions aren't enough, right? Compassionate action needs to be smart and informed.
Yeah. Kirby also highlights his amazing story about the power of simple touch. There's a patient who's terrified of needles, and she's getting ready for a procedure. Super anxious.
And a nurse just holds her hand the entire time.
It made all the difference.
Yeah.
It got me thinking a lot of us are scared of needles,
Right.
but it's like that human connection that gets us through it. Touch is like this powerful way of saying you're not alone.
It really is. And there's actual research to back that up.
Oh, wow.
Studies show that touch can reduce distress. It's like a physical way to provide comfort and support.
Okay. Now, the book also gets into some tricky dilemmas, like, should you help someone, even if it means bending the rules?
Mm.
Kirby talks about this research by Batson.
Where people are more likely to help a sick child move up on a treatment wait list, even if it means it's unfair to others.
That's the one. It's like, on the one hand, you want to help the child in need. But on the other hand, what about fairness for everybody else? It makes you think about how you balance your empathy with being just and fair.
It's like a classic conflict between what we feel is right and what we know is morally right. Sometimes our gut reaction to help someone might lead us to make a decision that has unintended consequences.
It's tough,
Yeah,
but it's important to think about.
right.
Kirby doesn't give us easy answers. He gets us thinking about the tough choices involved.
He doesn't shy away from the complexity. It's not easy.
Yeah.
Compassion can lead to difficult moral dilemmas.
Now, something else I found fascinating is how our families and our culture shape how compassionate we are. Kirby says that kids who are raised in really warm, supportive environments tend to be more compassionate as adults,
It makes sense.
like they learned it firsthand.
It's like they learn compassion by experiencing it themselves.
Right. But he contrasts that with how we raise kids in Western societies. It's a lot more isolated, with the burden often falling on the parents.
Hmm.
He actually calls this an evolutionary mismatch because for most of human history, we've lived in groups where childcare is shared.
Yeah. He even uses the term alloparenting, which means caring for children that aren't your own.
Wow.
hmm
So we're like going against our natural instincts for connection and support.
Almost like we're fighting our own biology. It can make it harder to develop compassion if it's not there in our early life.
Which brings us to fears of compassion.
Mm.
Kirby shares these stories about people who are afraid to give or receive compassion, because of past hurts.
Oh, wow.
It's powerful.
Yeah. It really resonates with me. I think a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah.
Like, we think of compassion as this good thing, but it can be scary.
Like in Good Will Hunting, when Will resist going to therapy because it makes him vulnerable.
Exactly. He's afraid to let someone in. He's afraid of being hurt again because of his past.
Yeah. It's fascinating how this emotion that's generally positive, can be a threat to us. It shows you how complex it is,
Yeah.
how it's connected to our personal history.
It highlights how past experiences can prevent us from connecting and healing, even when someone is giving us genuine compassion.
Now, before we get too bogged down in all the tough stuff, Kirby offers some hope. He talks about compassion-based programs. They use things like mindfulness and imagery to actually strengthen our compassion.
Yeah.
These programs, they offer a lot of hope. They show us that compassion isn't something that you either have or you don't, but something that can grow.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a muscle we can train.
It is. It really is.
And even just imagining being compassionate can have an impact. Kirby actually mentions a study where people simply visualized acts of kindness, and it activated the same brain areas as if they were actually being kind.
That's amazing.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. That's really cool. The brain doesn't always know the difference between what's real and what's imagined, so we can actually rewire ourselves, to be more compassionate.
So what are some of the specific techniques that are used? I'm curious. You're the expert here.
Well, one big one is mindfulness. Paying attention to the present moment without judging, without overthinking. And this helps us to become more aware of our own emotions and the needs of other people, their suffering.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard about loving kindness meditations,
Mm-hmm.
like setting good vibes to yourself and others.
Exactly. They're guided imagery exercises. You imagine yourself being compassionate to someone who's going through something hard.
Right.
It's like mental rehearsal for compassion in real life.
Kirby also talks a lot about self-compassion, which I think is so important,
Mhm.
especially in a world where we're constantly judging ourselves and being judged.
It is, and it's not about being selfish
Right.
or making excuses for yourself. It's about being kind to yourself and understanding yourself, just like you would treat a friend who's going through something difficult.
And he even shares his own research,
Mm-hmm.
where he shows that being kinder to yourself actually helps you learn from your mistakes and make positive changes.
Yeah.
It's not about lowering your standards. It's about having a more supportive inner voice, so you can actually reach your potential.
I love that.
Yeah.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Now, we've talked about how compassion is influenced by our upbringing and how we can even train those compassion muscles. But Kirby also touches on the role of technology. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, it's super fascinating. It's a huge area. Kirby explores how we can use virtual reality. Like, imagine being able to revisit a place that means a lot to you or connect with loved ones who are far away.
That's amazing.
Yeah, using technology to bridge those gaps of time and distance and connect.
He also sees potential in artificial intelligence and virtual humans,
Mm-hmm.
especially in healthcare. He's cautious about replacing human connection entirely, but sees it as a way to kind of add to traditional care.
Yeah.
So technology might be on the edge of a compassion revolution. It could really boost our ability to connect with others and ease suffering. What are your thoughts on that?
It's exciting, but we got to be careful,
Yeah.
Proceed with caution and make sure that we're using technology to help people and not hurt them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Technology is a powerful tool, and with any powerful tool, it's up to us to use it wisely and ethically.
Absolutely.
Now, I want to talk about something that Kirby calls compassionate contradictions.
Yeah.
He points out that we often do things that seem to contradict our compassionate values.
Right.
It's like we all have these blind spots
Mm-hmm.
where our actions don't match our beliefs. And I know I've been there.
Totally.
Kirby even uses this personal example. He was donating to this orangutan conservation charity,
Okay.
but he didn't realize he was using products that had palm oil, which actually hurts orangutans and causes deforestation.
Oh, wow.
It's like he had good intentions,
Mhm.
but ultimately was causing harm without realizing it. It's a classic example of our everyday choices having these unintended consequences.
It is. He also talks about how countries that have a reputation for being compassionate can have policies that actually contradict that,
Hmm.
like cuts to foreign aid or treatment of refugees.
It's like this huge question. How do we fix those contradictions?
Yeah.
How do we become aware of our blind spots and make choices that actually reflect our values?
I think it starts with being aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be willing to look at our own behavior and beliefs,
Hmm.
even if it makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Being open to learning from others, especially people with different views than us, is a big part of developing compassion.
So how do we go from just knowing about it to actually doing something? What steps can we take to be more compassionate?
Kirby says that developing habits and practices can help, like mindfulness,
Mm-hmm.
can help us become more aware of the suffering around us. And those compassion training exercises we talked about,
Yeah.
those can help us actually act with compassion, especially when things get hard.
And surrounding yourself with people who value compassion can also keep you motivated and accountable, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's like a positive feedback loop. The more you practice compassion, the easier it becomes. And when we see other people being compassionate, it inspires us to do the same.
Okay. We've talked about the challenges and possibilities of compassion, but there's one more crucial thing I want to discuss. Understanding suffering itself. Kirby has this whole chapter where he explores what suffering is. And it's so interesting how he goes beyond seeing suffering as just physical or emotional pain. He gets into the deeper psychological and even the existential stuff.
It is interesting. It goes really deep. He talks about Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. you know?
Sure.
Early in his life, his father tried to protect him from the world, but Siddhartha still ended up seeing all the suffering in the world.
That actually makes sense.
And it made him want to find a way to be free from suffering. Kirby highlights how the Buddhist teachings can help us understand how our own thoughts and attachments can actually make us suffer.
It's not just about what happens to us.
Right.
It's about how we react.
It's about how we relate to those things.
Yeah. Our own mind can kind of trap us,
It's true.
which brings us back to mindfulness.
Right.
Kirby explains how meditation can help us relate to suffering in a different way.
Instead of getting lost in the pain,
Yeah.
you can observe it, be curious about it, and accept it. And that makes space for healing and change.
He also talks about how self-criticism can make our suffering worse. You know, that inner voice that puts us down.
Right. And he says self-compassion is the answer to that.
Treating ourselves with the same understanding we would offer someone we care about.
Exactly.
So having a kinder inner voice can make a huge difference in how we deal with tough emotions.
It's one of the most important things in his book. We tend to judge ourselves so much more harshly than anyone else.
Right.
Self-compassion is about being kind to yourself.
We've talked about personal suffering, but Kirby also talks about the collective experience of suffering. He brings up the arithmetic of compassion. I find this fascinating, but also a little disturbing.
What is that?
It's the idea that we're less compassionate when there's more suffering.
Oh, wow. It seems like the opposite of what should happen. You'd think more suffering would make us more compassionate.
You would,
Uh-huh.
but research shows that our compassion can actually shut down when we see too much suffering, like it's too much to process.
Oh, wow.
Kirby talks about Paul Slovik's work on this.
Okay.
Slovik argues that our brains aren't designed to deal with huge numbers of people suffering. It's overwhelming, and our emotional response actually weakens.
Wow.
And this has real consequences. Like, we're more moved by a story about one person who is suffering, like the picture of that Syrian refugee boy, Alan Kurdi, than we are by statistics about millions of people who are suffering.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's easier to relate to one person's story than these big numbers.
And Kirby also brings up psychic numbing.
Oh, wow.
It's a defense mechanism
Yeah.
that protects us from being overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It's like we shut down emotionally to avoid feeling the full impact of the suffering around us.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it's not really a solution, is it?
No, not at all.
We can't just ignore it and hope it goes away.
He also mentions pseudo-inefficacy. It's the belief that our actions won't make a difference because there's so much suffering. It leads to feeling powerless.
Oh, wow.
But even small acts of compassion matter, right?
Yeah.
We might not be able to solve every problem, but we can help people.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't give up. Every act of compassion is important.
Imagine if millions of people did those small acts. It could really change things.
Absolutely.
Kirby says we need to create systems and environments that are compassionate. It's not enough to just focus on individual actions.
Yeah.
We have to address the systemic things that cause suffering.
Yeah, like with policies and advocacy.
Hmm.
We need to push for policies that are fair and just and help everyone.
And create workplaces and schools, communities that are compassionate.
I agree. Make compassion the rule, not the exception.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
This has been a pretty deep dive. I think it's incredibly valuable to look at all these sides of compassion. What stood out to you from Kirby's work?
I think for me, it's how compassion is more than just a feeling. It's about how you live your life, being courageous, being wise, and being willing to act, even when it's hard.
Compassion is a way of life. It's something you do all the time,
Mm-hmm.
not just once in a while.
Right.
It takes practice and commitment.
It does.
And Kirby gives us a plan for that journey,
Yeah,
showing us that we can all learn to be more compassionate.
absolutely. It makes me hopeful
Me too.
that a more compassionate world is possible.
I agree. Now, before we move on, I want to leave you with something to think about. Kirby talked about the power of touch. You know, even just holding someone's hand can make a difference. What are some other small, meaningful acts of compassion that we can incorporate into our everyday lives?
Yeah, it's a great question. How do we show compassion in those small, everyday moments?
It doesn't have to be complicated.
It doesn't.
It could just be those little intentional acts of kindness.
I'm really looking forward to exploring this more in the next part of our deep dive.
Me too.
You know, when we're thinking about those small acts of compassion, one that we often forget is just listening.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like really giving someone your full attention, being present with them can be so powerful.
Yeah, especially these days. It feels like everyone's always multitasking or distracted.
It's so true. It's easy to get caught up in your own thoughts. But when you take the time to really listen to someone, you know, without interrupting, without giving advice. It shows you care.
Yeah, it really does. It says, your words and experiences matter to me.
Right.
And I think that's really validating when someone feels like they're not being heard.
It's interesting how Kirby sees listening as a form of compassion training.
He does, yeah. He makes a really strong argument for that. The more we practice listening, the more we tune in to the suffering around us.
And then we're more likely to do something about it, both in our personal lives and as part of a bigger community.
Right. I want to go back to something we talked about earlier. The role of culture and upbringing in shaping how compassionate we are. I was really struck by Kirby's observations about how children are raised in different societies.
Me too. It's so interesting how cultural norms can affect how compassionate we are.
Like he talks about how in traditional cultures, kids are surrounded by extended family, interacting with lots of caregivers all the time.
Yeah, it's like this automatic support system.
Exactly. And it creates this feeling that we're all responsible for each other, especially the kids.
And then he contrasts that with how we do things in the West.
Yeah.
Where things are much more isolated.
Mm-hmm.
The burden falls on the parents, usually.
It's like we've forgotten that it takes a village.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, it makes me wonder if that isolation actually contributes to those fears of compassion that Kirby talks about. When we don't have that built-in support network, it makes sense that we'd be scared of being vulnerable or connecting with others.
Yeah, it's like you learn to protect yourself by keeping people at a distance.
And then it's harder to give and receive compassion.
It makes it harder to trust people.
Right. You might think they have ulterior motives.
Mm-hmm. Or worry about getting hurt.
Yeah.
It's really hard to unlearn those patterns and learn to trust yourself and other people.
But it sounds like it is possible.
It is.
Kirby seems to believe that we can work through those fears and be more compassionate.
Yeah, he emphasizes that we can change and grow. We're not stuck.
Okay, we've talked about culture, family, and even training our compassion muscles. But what about those times when we feel like our compassion is just collapsing?
Yeah.
What do you do when you feel overwhelmed or helpless, seeing all the suffering in the world?
That is a big question, something we all struggle with sometimes.
Kirby talks about the arithmetic of compassion, that we might feel less compassionate when we see more suffering.
I know, it's kind of hard to understand.
It is.
You'd think it would be the opposite, right?
You'd think so. But research shows that sometimes when we're faced with a huge amount of suffering, our compassion actually shuts down.
It's like it's too much.
It is. It's like our brains are overloaded.
Yeah.
And Kirby talks about Paul Slovik's work on this.
Oh, okay.
Slovik thinks our brains aren't built to process large numbers of victims. It's too overwhelming, and our emotional response gets weaker.
Wow.
And this has a real impact on how we act. We're more moved by a story about one person who is suffering than by statistics about millions.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's easier to connect with one person's story. Numbers are hard to wrap your head around.
Right. And Kirby also talks about psychic numbing.
Psychic numbing. What's that?
Well, it's this defense mechanism to protect us from getting overwhelmed.
Yeah, right.
It's like shutting down emotionally so you don't have to feel all the pain that's out there.
Yeah, I get that. But it's not a good solution, is it?
No, it's not. We can't just ignore suffering and expect it to go away.
We have to find a way to stay engaged without getting burnt out.
Exactly. Kirby also mentions pseudo-inefficacy.
Pseudo-inefficacy. Oh.
It's the belief that our actions won't matter because there's just so much suffering,
Oh, yeah.
leading to a sense of helplessness.
Yeah, it can feel like that sometimes.
It can, but it's important to remember that even small acts of compassion can make a difference. We might not be able to solve all the world's problems, but we can still help people.
Absolutely. I think it's important to remember that we can't give in to feeling hopeless.
Right.
Every act of compassion counts.
I love that. And imagine the impact if millions of people were doing those small acts.
Yeah, exactly. It could be a real force for good.
Kirby emphasizes the need for compassionate systems and environments. He says it's not enough to just focus on individual acts. We have to address the systemic issues that are causing the suffering.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, we need to be working on changing policies.
Yeah.
Doing advocacy work.
We need to fight for policies that are fair, just, and promote well-being for everybody. And we need to create compassionate workplaces, schools, and communities. Like fostering a whole culture of compassion, not just these one-off acts of kindness.
Absolutely. Making compassion the norm, not something special.
Yeah.
I like that.
This has been a pretty intense deep dive, but it's been so valuable to explore all these different aspects of compassion. What has stood out to you from Kirby's work?
I think for me, it's the idea that compassion isn't just this feeling you have. It's about how you live your life. It's about being courageous and wise and willing to act, even when it's tough.
Compassion is a way of life.
Exactly.
It's not something you do once in a while. It's something you embody
Mm-hmm.
in your thoughts, your words, your actions.
Right.
It takes practice and commitment,
Absolutely. And Kirby's book really gives us the tools we need.
a roadmap for that journey.
Yeah, he shows us that being compassionate is a skill that anyone can learn. And that makes me hopeful
Me too.
that a more compassionate world is possible.
Now, before we wrap up this part, I want to leave you with something to think about. We talked about the power of touch, how just holding someone's hand can make a difference. What are some other small but meaningful acts of compassion we can bring into our daily lives?
I love that question. It gets us thinking about how we can show compassion in everyday moments, you know?
It doesn't have to be some big gesture.
No, it does.
It's those little things, those intentional acts of kindness that can really make a difference.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to talking about this more in the next part of our deep dive.
Me too. All right, we're back for the last part of our deep dive into compassion. And I'm excited to pick up where we left off, exploring how we can use technology to create a kinder world.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge because technology often gets blamed for making us less connected.
Totally. We've all seen those movies where robots take over
Uh-huh.
or people are glued to their screens and they forget how to talk to each other.
Right. But Kirby says it's not that technology is good or bad, it's how we use it. And he sees a lot of potential for tech to actually boost compassion,
Yeah.
make it easier to connect and respond to suffering.
And he has some really cool examples, like using VR to help people develop empathy for those different from themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine walking in someone else's shoes, literally seeing the world through their eyes. That could be huge.
It could. Think about all the work being done with VR to simulate homelessness or to live with a disability. It's way more powerful than just reading about it.
Oh, for sure.
It puts you in the situation.
Right, and that's what sparks compassion. It's not just understanding it intellectually, you feel it in your gut.
Exactly. That's why VR is so powerful. It taps into our emotions. But beyond VR, Kirby sees AI playing a role too.
Yeah, like using AI to figure out who needs help the most.
Hmm.
Maybe someone struggling with mental health or facing poverty.
Right?
AI can analyze tons of data that we just can't. It can help us use resources better.
Yeah. It's like having a super compassionate assistant who's always looking for those who are hurting.
Right. And AI can also tailor support to each person. Imagine a chatbot trained to offer guidance to someone having a rough time.
Yeah. That could be incredible, especially for people who can't afford therapy.
Right. Or they don't feel comfortable talking to someone face to face.
Exactly. It's not about getting rid of human connection completely. It's about making support easier to get. But like you said, there are some downsides. We don't want to live in a world where robots are calling all the shots.
Totally. Kirby talks about using technology ethically and responsibly.
Right.
We need to make sure AI algorithms aren't biased.
Yeah.
And that people's privacy is protected.
Yeah. And we got to be careful about technology creating new inequalities. What if only the wealthy can afford this compassionate tech?
Right. It's like any tool. It can be used for good or bad. We have to
Yeah.
be thoughtful about how we use it.
Absolutely. We need to be having conversations about these ethical questions, like where do you draw the line with AI and compassion? When does it get too intrusive? These are hard questions, but we can't avoid them.
I agree. And this is why what Kirby says about developing our own compassion is so important.
Yeah.
Because tech just reflects us. If we're compassionate, we'll build compassionate technologies. But if we're greedy or fearful or prejudiced, that'll show up in the tech too.
It's true.
It's like that saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
We have to work on ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
on our own kindness and empathy,
Mm-hmm.
while we're building this amazing new tech.
Right. Otherwise, we're just giving powerful tools to people who might misuse them.
Exactly. But, I am optimistic.
Mm.
Seeing all the ways people are using tech for good now, it gives me hope.
Me too. Like connecting across the globe, raising awareness about social justice. We can build a better world.
And Kirby's book is a great starting point. Compassion isn't just some feeling, it's an active choice. We can choose to be compassionate in our personal lives, as a society, and through the technologies we create.
Yeah, totally. It's an invitation to use our potential to create a more just and loving world.
That's a beautiful thought. I think it's something we can all strive for.
Absolutely. It starts with each of us asking, what small act of compassion can I do today?
I love that question.
I,
I hope this deep dive has given everyone some inspiration. to explore their own journeys of compassion.
Me too. It's been great talking about this with you.
Likewise. And thanks to all of you for joining us on this deep dive into compassion. Until next time, keep choosing compassion.